I would like to invite our keynote speaker to join us and give us his address. George Katsiaficas received his PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 1983. From 1969, he has been active in social movements. In 1970, he graduated from MIT while in solitary confinement after being convicted of disturbing a school for organizing anti-war protests. He moved to California, where he was part of a deep network of countercultural counter-institutions during the 1970s in Ocean Beach. He was long active against the CIA and for Palestinian self-determination. A student of Herbert Marcuse, he authored books on the global imagination of 1968, as well as European autonomous movements. His books can be found here, published by PM Press. Together with Kathleen Cleaver, he edited Liberation, Imagination, and the Black Panther Party. His two-volume Asia's Unknown Uprisings places the 1980 Kwangju People's Uprising in South Korea at the center of an Asian wave that overthrew 8 dictatorships in 6 years. His latest book is The Global Imagination of 1968, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Dr. Katsiaficas.
Thank you, Debashish. And
Do you need your PowerPoint as well, right?
Yes, it's available. We can start it in a minute. I really was moved by what Mike said, and I wanted to just follow up with that if I could, because the picture of the earth that he mentioned and the inner vision that he mentioned are tied together for me, because 1968 and that period was a time when intuitively, in the inner vision of millions, perhaps billions of people, the species was one. We recognized that the life of a Vietnamese was the same as the life of an American, and that war was an unnecessary evil. There was no such thing as a just war for us. And we opposed war entirely. We opposed, in fact, at our best, governments, nation states with militarized weapons of mass destruction. And that vision has continued today. And it's that inner vision that I think is one of the enduring legacies. We see, unfortunately, our president today rolling back, and the administration rolling back many of the gains that we made. And yet the inner vision within us is growing, is still intact. And I think this conference wants to explore how, in fact, that occurs and what we can do to make that grow in the future. So thank you, Mike, for that wonderful introduction, invocation. So just a word of what is 1968? It's more than a year, because really, we can trace 1968 very far back. For instance, did it begin with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, when Rosa Parks, for the second time, refused to give up her seat on a bus, and the civil rights movement that leads to the crescendo of 1968? Did it last through the Kwangju Uprising, which was a New Left uprising in 1980? How can we temporalize that period? How can we analyze it? I think at least we have to say that the United States experienced its 1968 in 1970, 2 years after the French May events and the global uprising that goes from the Tet Offensive through the French strike, through the Chicago Convention. In 1970, there was a 5-month period of prolonged rupture with the established system. I think everybody remembers Kent State and Jackson State universities, where 6 students were murdered by government forces, by the Ohio National Guard and the Mississippi Highway Patrol, for protesting the war in Vietnam, for the extension of the war into Cambodia, I should say more precisely. But in that same period of time, there were many forces in the United States that also reached their peak. Of course, after the shootings, the campuses went on strike. More than 4 million students and faculty were on strike. Not for their own interests. It was a strike to end the war in Indochina, to stop university complicity with war, particularly at places like MIT, which we dubbed the Pentagon on the Charles, for the millions of dollars of contracts it had for research and development. And also for an end to the repression of the Black Panther Party and repression. It was not about lowering tuition fees. It was not about the self-interest of students in the traditional sense of what is meant by self-interest. Peace and justice were the issues that students enunciated as most important to their strike. So it was a very different kind of strike. In fact, if we look at it, it was the largest strike in the history of the United States, the largest single strike, meaning workers, farmers, whomever, this strike. But it was not only the student strike that happened, because in the same period of time, the military, within the military, there was a revolt. More than 60,000 young men deserted from the military in 1970. There was an enormous number of GIs who came back. By May 1970, Vietnam Veterans Against the War had 2,000 members and had assumed the leadership of the anti-war movement. So then they became extraordinarily important to the next 5 years of the anti-war movement. Women had organized in 1968 to protest the Miss America contest. And in 1970, more than 100,000 women marched as a general strike for the Equal Rights Amendment in more than 40 cities across the United States. And the modern symbol of feminism was born in preparation for that event. Among Latinos, in New York City, what had been called the butcher shop, Lincoln Hospital, where botched abortions resulted in dead females, and where what the community really needed, for instance, addiction control centers were lacking. The Young Lords Party took over the hospital. They brought in with them addicts and set up a rehabilitation clinic in which they educated the addicts about the CIA's role in importing heroin, and put up posters of Che Guevara and other revolutionary leaders, and used revolution as a way to bring these folks out of addiction to heroin. In Los Angeles, there was the third, what was called the Latino Chicano anti-war moratorium, Chicano anti-war moratorium, which had been really a festive event. Families came, tens of thousands of people, some people say more than 100,000 people showed up, when in the midst of a celebration and anti-war protest, tear gas canisters began to be lobbed over the crowd arriving on the stage. People tried to leave, they were blocked by police. Police began using clubs and later firearms. At least 3 people were killed, including what many people believe was a targeted assassination of Ruben Salazar, leading Chicano journalist, writer for the Los Angeles Times. And of course there were follow-up demonstrations among Latinos in New York and LA. But finally the denouement of the US 1968 in 1970 was September 1970 in Philadelphia, where the Black Panther Party organized a rainbow coalition to write a new constitution for the United States. In the days before the convention, the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, by the way, it was People's S apostrophe, not apostrophe S. And because it was such a vibrant gathering from international constituency, but one of the first times gay people had participated in the movement in a very organized way. They marched into the hall where there were more than 10,000 people assembled, chanting gay, gay power to the gay, gay people. And, power to the people, the brown, brown power, red, red power, yellow, yellow power. They didn't chant white, white power to the white, white people, but Fred Hampton had said as much, that white people should have white power. And Nelson Mandela had echoed that sentiment in his own time. But the Constitutional Convention occurred despite massive police repression. The Panthers were closed down in Philadelphia. All the men were stripped naked and forced to run through the streets so that photographers could publish their pictures in the paper, hoping to prevent people from coming to Philadelphia. Buses were stopped, not allowed into the city. People were pulled off of flights. I was one of the lucky ones who made it to Philadelphia, even though, as the 60s slogan is that if you can remember what you did, you weren't there. So I talked with the fellow I went with. How did we get there? Can't remember. Where did we stay? Can't remember. We do remember Muhammad Ali being there, just as a normal participant. And I went up to him and shook his hand and said, "So glad to see you, champ." He said, "Happy to be here." It was, wonderful in that way. And I do remember Michael Tabor's opening speech, what an eloquent young man he was, and Audrey Jones, the leader of the Black Panther Party speech. But I also remember that Huey Newton, only recently released from prison, really fell flat in his speech. He disappointed so many of us because he was a very good thinker. He was an amazing organizer. He was a courageous individual. He was a hero to all of us, but he was a terrible speaker. He could not speak, he was not a good public speaker. And he was as disappointed as us as we were in him. So the convention happened, the documents that were written produced a much more radical version of what this society should look like than the original 10-point program of the Black Panther Party. For instance, it said, every reference to man and men should be replaced by human being and humans. That not only should black men be exempt from the army, as the Panthers had maintained, but the army should be abolished. There should be no standing military. Not only should every African American be given 40 acres and a mule, as Lincoln had promised and as the Black Panther Party 10-point program asserted, but that the United States wealth should be redistributed among all the peoples of the world, and that the world should move forward with the wealth that is needed to build prosperity for all. These documents are in the back of the book that Ramsey is selling for PM Press, The Global Imagination of 1968. There was supposed to be a follow-up 2 months later, but the CIA and the FBI prevented the Panthers from renting a space in Washington, D.C. They had a couple of spaces they had agreed upon, and they were visited by the government, and people just said, no, you can't have the space. Even though people came, and Huey promised something would happen in the future, within the next 89 days, in other words, less than 3 months, the split in the Black Panther Party occurred. And Huey decided to basically expel anyone who did not move to Oakland. He closed down all the chapters in the party. So the leadership of that Rainbow Coalition disappeared. And I think we all know that even though the popular movement subsided, protests continued on a very massive level. For instance, in Christmas 1972, when the United States mined Haiphong Harbor and bombed Hanoi subsequently, protests were much larger than they had been at any other time in terms of the numbers of people involved. Bill Walton, a basketball player, for instance, was arrested at UCLA protesting in this period of time. Many celebrities began to get involved more and more. Of course, they had some, like Jane Fonda, had already been. But the point here is the movement had produced a break with the system. Polls consistently showed Ho Chi Minh was more popular on college campuses than Richard Nixon, the president of the United States. What a huge break with the established system. So then, in the rest of my talk, the time I have, I'd like to show you a PowerPoint so that we can see some of the images and relive these moments. How do we move the slides? You'll do it? Okay. I don't want to go too fast, but I don't want to go too slow either. So, actually, I think these lights need to be turned on. Can you see the screen? No?
It's just warming up.
Oh, there's nothing on it?
It's not yet.
Coming.
I see. Good. So, next slide, please. Okay, these are the two books that were already mentioned. Next slide, please. And I think these are also two books, The Asia's Unknown Uprisings. Next slide, please. So, like 1968, there were waves of revolutionary movements that appeared unexpectedly. 1848, 1905 were periods like 1968 where there were no seizures of state power. Although the insurgents in Vienna held Vienna for quite some time in 1848, but in 1968 there was not an attempt to seize power by what was called the New Left as opposed to the Old Left. Keep going, please. So this planetary wave, which we've already talked about in terms of how the astronauts could see the planet, but how people's inner vision understood a planetary culture, really has to be seen as having been motivated by Vietnam's struggle. Hegel had said world history moves from east to west, and in 1968 the Tet Offensive affected the world enormously. It was, of course, the world's first televised war, instantaneous news. And the fact is, on the biggest holiday in East Asia, in Vietnam, when almost all of the Vietnamese troops fighting for the United States, or on the side of the United States, were home for the holidays, every major city and every US base was attacked simultaneously. It was an extraordinary event. Next slide, please. And we've already talked about the list of what happens in 1968. Next slide, please. But in Vietnam, the guerrillas, who you see here with US Secret Agent 019, Ho Chi Minh, during World War II. In case you didn't know, you can look it up. But the guerrilla forces were not North Vietnamese forces. They were indigenous South Vietnamese guerrillas, the National Liberation Front. And so cleverly was the offensive constructed that a diversionary action involving some 40,000 Vietnamese troops in the mountains of Khe Sanh was set up. And the US military believed that was the big offensive everybody was talking about. But in fact, that was a diversionary action, and the offensive occurred in the cities. Hue, the second largest city of South Vietnam, was held for 3 weeks by the National Liberation Front. The American Embassy grounds in Saigon was held for a time by the guerrillas. The embassy building itself was not taken, but the grounds were taken. Next slide, please. And this was happening in the same moment as the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So the East is where these movements can be seen to have been really begun in that year. Next slide, please. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. The United States experienced its worst violence since the Civil War. More damage was done to the city of Washington, D.C. than the British had done during the War of 1812. For the first time in almost a century, armed troops surrounded the White House and the Capitol. The Pentagon asked for some additional troops to fight the war in Vietnam, and Johnson's analysis was that he could not use them because his advisors told him they did not have enough troops to fight the war in Vietnam and protect the nation's capital. So there was a real threat that was perceived by Martin Luther King, of course, was I won't say student of Gandhi, but had studied Gandhi, really was a great proponent of the philosophy of nonviolence. And his assassination marked the end, I think, really, of the vibrancy of the, let's call it the reformist phase of the civil rights movement. From then on, the revolutionary movement of led by the Black Panthers became the main force in the African American movement. Go ahead, next slide, please. Then in France, in May 1968, these things began to have very, who can say where they began, but actually the specific incident that led to police brutality, that led to arrests, that led to the spiral of repression and resistance, involved some long-haired men in blue jeans spending the night in an all-women's dormitory. And the police were called in by one of the women who worked in the dormitory as a chaperone. And the men ran out of the dorm, ran into a lecture hall, and the police went in looking for anyone with long hair wearing blue jeans and began beating them up. And students protested, and the spiral led within weeks to a general strike involving anywhere from 6 to 10 million workers in France, all of the universities. The country came to a standstill. I've heard stories how, those days when there were still borders going into France, nobody was working at the borders. So you just drove into France. So people from all over Europe went to Paris. Next slide, please. On May 10th, the street fighting, people won control of the streets of Paris against the police. These are significant kinds of victories when people defeat the forces of the government in urban areas. It means the liberated area. The Sorbonne, the University of Strasbourg was occupied, but the Sorbonne became a liberated space, as did eventually the Odeon Theater and other cultural sites in Paris became almost continual meeting sites. Workers had come to the Sorbonne very timidly at first, but when they were welcomed by the students, the workers' strike then began to spread. Next slide, please. You can see the barricades here in the streets of Paris, the night after the day after the night of the barricades. Next slide, please. And here, what was called the Students' Soviet at the Sorbonne. And next slide, please. Cultural workers were an important part of the leadership of the movement. We normally think of workers as factory workers. They were very important, but it was the cultural workers, film workers, theater actors, who were extremely at the front. Television personalities refused to read the news. They said, the news is wrong. What they've given me is wrong. This is not correct. I'm not going to read it on air. And then the statements were made, the police shows you're watching at night on your television screen are bringing the police into your home in ways that are not proper. Next slide, please. So the workers joined the movement. For a time, no one knew what would happen in France. And the Communist Party then organized a series of talks with the government and won an astonishing reforms. Like a 35% pay raise for workers, pay for all the days of the strike, lower retirement age. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. But the workers wanted something different. They didn't just want some better wages or lower working week. They wanted a new civilization, a new life. As it is, right? We don't want to negotiate with the bosses, abolish them. Next slide. The boss needs you, you don't need him. And unions. So when the Communist Party union leaders came to assemble thousands of workers, the workers threw their lunches at them, threw bottles at them, coffee at them, and booed them, and they had to leave the stage. So for a time, no one knew what was happening. What do these people want? Next slide, please. Artists became very important at this moment in the leadership of the movement. They were a voice, and they were used to speaking in public. So they were able to provide a voice to what the movement was about. Go ahead, please. The strike continues. here. In other words, even though the communists had negotiated a settlement, what was called the Grenelle settlement, the strike continued. Ultimately, next slide please, here are the terms of the negotiation that was reached. Astonishing when we think of today's commands that we all work longer hours for more years for less money, and looking forward to the attacks on Social Security and Medicare that Trump is, I think, aiming at. But one of the visions that came out of the French movement was a working 20 hours a week, that everyone working 20 hours a week should suffice, that everybody could have a job, there would be plenty to go around. Next slide, please. They wanted to destroy capitalism. These are some of the posters from the students at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Next slide, please. The idea of self-management was the key to what the strikers wanted. They wanted to run their own affairs. They wanted to determine what to produce, how to produce it, not simply to take orders from the bosses. Next slide, please. And the counterculture in this period played a very important role in helping to make the movement international. Many foreign workers said for the first time they felt welcomed in France. And the internationalism of the movement was such that when Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was a German Jew living in France, studying, he was a leader of the student movement, was expelled, people marched in the streets of Paris, including a contingent of Arabs, chanting, "We are all German Jews." So the solidarity was enormous. You can imagine it was a time of this great imagination, of global consciousness. Keep going, please, next slide. The idea that boredom was an enemy, I think many of you would agree, I think, that's, what is boredom, how is it, but the system of mass production. Anyway, next slide, please. Then the French movement was repressed. It's not well documented. Heavy-duty police actions, the threat of a military coup d'etat. De Gaulle vanished, met with his generals in Germany, and the French movement was suppressed, but then soon thereafter, Czechoslovakia was invaded. And the stories of resistance, generally passive resistance is known. The Czechs took down street signs, took down the signs on buildings. It took several days for the Russians to find the post office. And many of them, almost none of them could speak Czech, from what I've been told by people in the Czech Republic. I've visited many times. Next slide, please. But there was more than passive resistance. People did fight back. Next slide, please. Oh, let's go back to Czechoslovakia one moment. So ignorant were the Russian troops that the Czech movement was led by the Czech Communist Party. The writers' union, the students in Strahov, the district above the city, had all been very active. The writers' union had sponsored a Kafka revival. And there was a cultural awakening, a political awakening. Alexander Dubček, the leader of the Communist Party, spoke of socialism with a human face. And the Russians tolerated it for a time, but by August they invaded. Dubček was forced to spend the next 20 years shoveling coal into furnaces to heat buildings. And when finally the revolution happened in 1989, he was immediately, by popular acclaim, brought back before Havel, Václav Havel, was made the new leader of the country. But one very interesting book by a conservative talked about how thousands of Communist Party delegates exchanged ID cards with workers in a steel factory, and that the Communist Party had a convention in the steel mill in front of Soviet Russian guards where they discussed whether or not to have passive resistance or active resistance. Of course, they decided on passive resistance because of the overwhelming force that was arrayed against them. But the fact that they could have this meeting right under the noses of their Russian guards without the Russians noting what even they were talking about and not being able to really check their IDs. I mean, the joke in Czechoslovakia is that it was really the most stupid people who were the Czech police. Anyway, let's go on. I could tell stories. Mexico City, the coming Olympics. There was a strong student movement, a student strike. Students were seeking to better their university system with the coming Olympics and the attention. But the government responded with enormous repression. At least 400 people were killed as the Olympics approached. At a peaceful rally in Mexico City at Tlatelolco Plaza, the police opened fire. They killed the 2 speakers on the stage. That was the first shots. But then just continual shooting throughout the night. They followed people into hospitals and killed them in their beds who had been wounded. They shot them in back alleys. They invaded apartments. It was a terrible massacre. And you know, tragedy in Mexico is nothing new, but this tragedy really has begun a cycle of violence that is unending in Mexico to this day. Here's the rally here. So the question that the New Left posed was not about seizing power, right? It challenged the old left's power in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, ultimately in the Soviet Union, and one could say there is a continuity to the wave of uprisings in 1989 against Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe. And the strikes of May 68 in France and May 70 in the United States both had the same basic goals. That is, international solidarity and self-management. You know, the French at this point were not involved in a major war. So that there was not the Algerian War had ended, right? The Indo-Chinese War had ended. France in the 1960s, it was talked of as a neutral space by many people. But in the United States, of course, war was a major concern in this period of time. Next slide, please. I had a eureka moment in studying these movements as I sat at my table in Ocean Beach, California, San Diego, that these movements, when I looked at my research notes, these movements had occurred really in relationship to each other more than to internal political dynamics or economic conditions. So that when the general strike occurred in France, students and workers in Mexico City, Berlin, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Berkeley, and Belgrade were also having major events. In Spain and Uruguay, they attempted general strikes of their own. In Italy, the prime minister was forced to resign. Germany experienced its worst political crisis since World War II. They passed the Notstandsgesetze, the emergency laws, that gave the government powers that it had not had since the times of the Nazis to declare martial law. And at the University of Dakar, Senegal, a student strike led to a general strike of workers. This is how did these movements, well, certainly there's years of organizing that lead up to this. There are events, but the fact that they occurred with such synchronicity is what struck me in this moment. And I named this phenomenon the eros effect. As a student of Herbert Marcuse, I was very attracted to the idea of the life force, eros, as opposed to thanatos, the death forces. I mean, many of us in the movement said revolution is the way to life. When people ask, well, what kind of revolution do you believe in? We said, a revolution that frees all life from oppression, that brings prosperity to all people. And this eros effect is something that I have observed later. I think there'll be another slide about it. Keep going, please. So these are what differentiated the movements of 1968 from previous movements. That there was opposition to many forms of oppression, racial, gender-based, patriarchal domination, as well as economic exploitation. Freedom as not only freedom from material deprivation, but also freedom to create new human beings, to change ourselves, not just change the system. Malcolm X's idea of change, Martin Luther King's so-called New Negro, as he named it, Che Guevara's New Socialist Man, as he said, New Socialist Human, that would be motivated by morality, not material incentives. More democracy, not less, participatory democracy, and large base of revolution, and an emphasis on direct action, as opposed to waiting. Next slide, please. Herbert Marcuse, my teacher's notion of eros is what was central to this for me. And some of the other New Left theorists, I think you know, Jean Genet, the French playwright, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir. Next slide, please. This was Marcuse's famous slogan, right? Be realistic, ask for the impossible. Demand the impossible, actually. Go ahead, next slide, please. Genet. Next slide, please. Your happiness is being bought, steal it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, I try to trace the development of these world historic movements. I think we should move to the next slide, and this will be available. Debashish has this if anyone is interested. But after can you go back one second? After 1968, there are other episodes of this eros effect. The disarmament movement, 1980 to 81. Do you remember there were nuclear freeze initiatives passed in dozens of American cities, and the disarmament movement in Europe convinced Gorbachev that he didn't need to worry about another German invasion of Russia. So this movement had a profound effect on world politics. Then the wave of East Asian uprisings that I talk about in my books on Asia's unknown uprisings. I'm not sure if I have a slide on it, but the revolt against Soviet regimes, the ultra-globalization movement from the Zapatistas, Seattle, and the massive anti-war mobilizations, and the Arab Spring, Indignados, and Occupy movement. These were all times in which somehow overnight you had hundreds, even thousands of places where movements acted in synchronicity with each other. I believe this is, like I said, one of the legacies of 1968 is that inner vision, that we're one species, and that we need to act around the world in unified fashion to bring about change. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Again, this is way too much. Next slide, please. Okay, so just for the Asian movements, I guess I didn't put a slide in. I'd just like to mention, because many of you know this, and no one has ever, I think, really put it together. 86, the Philippines. 87, South Korea overthrew their dictatorship. The Philippines overthrew Marcos, right, who had been a dictator for you. 88 in Burma, 2 dictatorships were overthrown before a third consolidated itself. 89 in Tibet and China, Tiananmen Square. 90 in Taiwan. The longest martial law in the world in Taiwan was ended. Bangladesh overthrew its dictatorship. And in Nepal, the absolute monarchy was overthrown. 1992, in Thailand, the military dictatorship was overthrown. And these are, dealing with 4 religions, multiple languages, different cultures, and yet in a region of the world where most Western observers say democracy is not so important, you have an enormous wave of uprisings for democracy. So these are, I think, what unites movements today, which comes straight out of the movements of 1968. I realize the conference is about Oroville, and I am sorry not to have included more about India. India's contribution in this period, I think, is what this conference will also bring out, so that more of us become aware of it. Next slide, please. I believe that's it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think that's enough. Let's see. Oh, I did bring a slide. I should talk for a moment about the Kwangju Uprising, because more than any other event of the 20th century, it reveals the capacity of people to govern themselves and the need to get rid of militarized nation states. basically Korea had been under South Korea had been under systems of military government since the end of the Korean War. You could argue since the end of World War II, where the United States had imposed Syngman Rhee as the ruler of South Korea. Of course, Rhee had been forced out. There was a one-year period of great promise, after which, with advanced knowledge of the United States, Park Chung-hee seized power in 1961, after the 1960 revolution that overthrew the Syngman Rhee regime. And he was assassinated in 1979. All over Korea, there was a great sigh of relief. People thought the time for democracy had come. A new United States-backed military coup occurred. And Chun Doo-hwan, the new dictator, put the message, anyone who protests will face the army. Only in Kwangju did people continue to protest for democracy, and he sent the army, and the army brutalized the city. I mean, they attacked city buses, they attacked the students, there were reports of women raped, taxi drivers who stopped to pick up students to take them to the hospital, killed by the military, bayonets, paratroopers pulled off of the front line with North Korea with US approval. The police chief of Kwangju refused to order his men to work with the army to open fire. He was taken away and tortured. The military commander of the local army divisions refused to order his men to use live ammunition. Paratroopers landed behind his command post, took him away, and tortured him. So this whole region felt they were being attacked, rightfully so. Most regions would have just given up, but somehow, miraculously really, in Kwangju, people began to fight back with 2x4s, with sharpened bamboo sticks. Then the police let their armories be taken by people. Many police took their uniforms off, joined the uprising. Armories, because as you know, South Korea is in a continual state of preparedness for warfare. Armories were raided. The workers at the biggest factory in Kwangju, which then was called Asia Motors, delivered more than a dozen armored cars, new armored cars, to the insurgents. You know, ironically, even though the US was behind the South Korean military, one of the most militant groups that formed called themselves the SWAT team. They took an old van, they took, you know, the metal plates that cover holes in the road, and soldered them, or whatever, welded them to the sides of the vehicle, got every weapon they could. They emptied their pockets, except their family's name and phone number and address, so that they could be delivered in case they died. Got every imaginable weapon they could find, and wherever they heard firing, went from place to place and helped push the military out of the city. Citizens won control of the city and held it, governing it through general assemblies, where anyone could speak, open general assemblies, open mic. And, you know, all this time fighting was going on the outskirts of the city. So you had a citizens' army that formed from nothing. There was no citizens' army. All of the activists had left the city. When the army first came, the activists said, "I'm next." Or there were arrests, actually, the night before the military arrived. So many were arrested. Others left the city when they heard about the arrest. So without activists, many activists present, there were a few. Yoon Sang-won has become the sort of known leader. He was killed the last day of when the US pushed the South Korean military to go in massively, which they did with helicopters and tanks. But it's a remarkable story because even when the differences among the people were severe, you can imagine the respected leaders of the city are saying, "This is crazy, we should surrender. The military is going to kill us all." And the young militants, who by now are all armed, shooting their guns in the air and saying, "No, no, no, we're not going to give up these guns until the military apologizes and releases all the prisoners." And you know, they're having this discussion at a meeting like this. And someone in the back says, "The workers at the factory have offered us armored cars." And something like 15 people went to get the cars, but they only brought 8 cars the first time. Why? Because 7 of them didn't know how to drive. These were not your, Koreans who were part of the economic development. This was a marginalized district where the community was still intact. Someone else says, look, they're not going to free our prisoners. They want our guns. And then, someone says, we have plenty of guns. We have more guns than people who know how to use them. So let's send them a truckload of guns and get a truckload of prisoners in exchange. And they did it. This is the kind of thing that happened at the meeting. Someone else said, we don't have enough coffins for all the dead. The high school girls had made it their mission to assemble and clean the bodies of the dead, lay them out in a taekwondo studio so that the families could come sadly and recognize them or try. Many were so disfigured they couldn't be recognized. So they ran out of coffins. So they said, okay, we'll send more guns. This is the kind of free-flowing discussion that occurred and the great intelligence that people showed. And as I say, differences were for the, tolerated. There was no violence among people. So this led to the break in Asia. I think this is the key point. The man who was arrested for this, Kim Dae-jung, was sentenced to death and was released to the United States, to Harvard University, where he met Benigno Aquino, who had been sentenced in the Philippines. They became very good friends. So it's very apparent to me that the Kwangju Uprising was well known to the Aquinos and to the Philippine people. So anyway, let me stop there. I'm looking forward to your questions and to Ramsey's intervention in the next part of our program. Thank you very much.
Conduct a conversation and open it to the audience as he feels.
So I'll try and keep myself and George's conversation brief because I suspect and hope that you guys have a lot of questions and comments. But I'm going to ask George a couple of loaded questions, but he doesn't know which way the rifle is pointing. George, you told me that when we were chatting privately that it was actually your gateway, if you like, to the events you've described, and your personal journey started with Woodstock. So I'm wondering perhaps if you could talk a little about that, both the kind of clash of the counterculture and the new left, and the tensions, and perhaps some of the cliches, dispel some of that. I mean, one of the cliches that I'm sure you've all heard is, of course, it was the hippies versus the hard hats. Hippies itself, of course, is a loaded term since that was a media-invented creation. But nevertheless, the media was setting up not only two supposedly youth cultures, but they were also setting up class antagonisms. So perhaps you could speak a little to that.
Well, Ramsey, you're perfectly right that Woodstock was a very significant event in my life, and I don't really talk about myself much, but you caught me here, so I will make a confession. I crowd surfed at Woodstock, and it was by accident, because I was with some other friends, and someone mentioned they had left a gallon jug of wine in the car, and nobody wanted to go get it, but I felt like having a look around, and I went to get it, and then as I was trying to get back, I think people read my face, and, oh my God, I can't step over one more person. And people said, come on. And I did, and of course I poured wine in people's mouths, and it was like utopia. It was a utopian moment. There were babies born, and that clash you're mentioning doesn't really exist there, to me. Of course, in the scope of the next period of time, as the anti-war movement grows more powerful, a tremendous reaction is organized at the highest levels of government. We all know about the COINTEL program, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, which targeted especially the Black Panther Party. But I was also a target of that program. And I mean, it was horrible stuff that happened. Like, you know, my grandmother, who was born in the city she always called Constantinople, and was rather insecure, having lost her homeland, and sort of then moved to Egypt, and then moved out of Egypt, and then come to the United States, where she taught in the Greek school for years, was visited in her retirement home by the FBI, who told her that because of her grandson's actions, she was going to be deported. And you can imagine the trouble that caused me. That was a way to get at somebody that no one else, I think, could get to. You know, anyway.
With all due respect, you're not answering my question.
So, you know, look, I mean, at a time when I became involved in the movement, the student movement was not so important at places like Columbia, Harvard, and the Ivy League schools. It was at Kent State, Jackson State. It was the working class schools. And we, the core of the activist movement that had gathered on May 1st in New Haven to support the Black Panther Party and Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins, who were on trial for their lives, considered ourselves freaks. We were neither hippies nor, let's say, politicos. We were freaks. We were a combination of the two. So I think that's a false dichotomy in that period when the movement reaches its high point. In terms of the class dynamics, those were very real. But many sectors of the working class supported us. But look, to be sure, if all the constituencies I mentioned as having been active in 1970, I did not mention the workers. And there's a reason for it. I wanted to say the workers were in the leadership of the movement. There was a Teamsters strike. The authorization to call out the National Guardsmen who killed the students at Kent State had been made because of the Teamsters strike, not because of the student movement originally. But the Teamsters strike was not in solidarity with the students. And the students tried to act in solidarity with the Teamsters, but it just did not work. Later, a left group organized Teamsters for a Democratic Union and had great success. But in 1970, in that particular period of time, a minority of working class organizations signed on to the peace movement. George Meany, head of the AFL-CIO, totally supported Nixon and the war. Brennan, I think his first, not sure his first name, but the leader of the Construction Workers Union, went to the White House after his people had attacked anti-war protesters and gave Nixon an honorary hard hat. And he was later named Secretary of Labor in the administration. So, and it should be remembered, in this period of time, the construction industry all over the United States was being picketed by African Americans for their refusal to hire African Americans in large numbers. So there was, to say there was a conflict that between, let's say, what we could call workers and the anti-war movement, the movement against racism, is accurate. To say there has been a conflict between ecology movement and workers is accurate. At MIT, where I was involved, we organized enormous protests at the laboratories that did the war research and development, the instrumentation laboratories, today called the Draper Labs. And I mean, they developed radar systems that were used on the ground in Vietnam. They developed the vertical takeoff and landing helicopter. They developed a stabilization system for helicopters. The GIs called them Puff the Magic Dragon. This helicopter would come in and obliterate everything in 100 yards of the helicopter with so much firepower, simultaneously firing. The helicopters would flip over because of the firepower. So MIT developed a gyroscopic stabilization system so that these helicopters could fire in any direction without having to fire in both directions to keep stable. The workers in the I-Labs, I was there picketing one day, and the leader of their union recognized me, and he said, "Katsiaficas, you know, blah, blah, you're always acting against us. Why don't you talk to us? And I said, I'll talk with you anytime, any place. And we had a meeting in Kresge Auditorium at MIT. The workers were not hostile to us. These were white-collar workers, let's say. And they said, look, I have to support my family. I have this job. Again, I don't know if I'm answering your question fully, Ramsey. I'm giving you anecdotal answers
so
to the question.
let me interject again then. I know from the program that there's going to be a lot of talk about the counterculture here in the Bay Area. So another of the cliched tropes, if you like, is that other than, you know, perhaps the diggers that were mentioned and perhaps the mine troupe, that basically the new left, if you like, or politics, and the counterculture were basically pretty much diametrically opposed, and perhaps the only thing they had in common was maybe, you know, smoking some marijuana, and maybe, you know, joining Mike here and perhaps the odd concert. But there was basically, and I've been told this by, you know, say people that work with the Panthers, for example, that they had nothing but disdain for the so-called counterculture because they perceived it to be basically apolitical.
I have a really different memory of the movement. For instance, People's Park, the struggle for People's Park, brought in an enormous constituency in Berkeley. And you know, James Rector was killed, 128 people were wounded by the gunshot, the bird shot that the police fired. It was an enormous struggle. It was very much a countercultural struggle that was political. So I think, and that's just one indication of other struggles like that. The struggle for rent control came out of people living in communes. The local history here in the Bay Area includes the be-ins. When you say smoking weed, I mean, the Black Panthers.
I have never inhaled, just so you know.
The Black Panthers I know, and I think they wouldn't mind if I said so, love to smoke weed. In fact, at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, one of the workshops came up with this formulation about drugs, that marijuana, hashish, LSD, and mescaline are life drugs. They can be useful in the formation of a revolutionary consciousness, but may become hindrances to political work once a revolutionary consciousness is attained. No revolutionary action should be attempted while under the influence of these drugs. Heroin, cocaine, and speed are death drugs, and they should be eliminated from the communities by any means necessary. It's almost, the documents are in the back of the book. So the Black Panther Party, I think, can be criticized for many things, but not for being against weed. That's an unfair criticism.
That was not my criticism. I said that's the only thing they had in common.
Oh, I'm sorry, but you said
that's all right. But
the counterculture, though.
The only thing they had in common, the new left and the counterculture, was
weed.
Was imbibing of the life drugs.
Okay, but very clearly, at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, 3 flags were flying. Not the flag of the United States of America. The flag of the Black Panther Party, the flag of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, and the flag of the Youth International Party, which had as I recall, red star and marijuana leaf on it. But the Youth International Party had helped to organize the demonstrations in Chicago. They were very active in the anti-war movement. So the respect shown by the Panthers at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention to the yippies, to the counterculture, to the gay liberation movement, to the women's movement, which to me are part of that counterculture. I know most people like to say it's the hippies over here, but you know, I was there in these times when the women's movement was going bread and roses in the Boston area, a coalition of women. They very much grew out of the counterculture. That was where these organizations came from. took over a building. They asked us to help with security and other things. So there was, the radical feminist idea was there shouldn't be war. Not that women should go in the military, but that there shouldn't be a military. So it was, a very different time. Go ahead.
Can I ask one more question, if I may? So there's always, as is often the case at gatherings of folks that were politically activist, at the tender age of 52, I'm often the youngest person in the room. I won't claim that necessarily today, but pretty close. Which leads me to the question, and again, the tension of, undoubtedly, which is partly why we're all here, the so-called long 60s, 70s, were world-shattering momentous events. Yet, since then, the left, counterculture, pretty much everything we're talking about has been in pretty much absolute decline, in real terms, in every other way. How can we explain why these ideas had such resonance then? And how do we explain or attempt to grapple with the problems and difficulties of the transmission of those ideas to future generations? If you want to have a stab at those thorny issues.
Well, those are, when I was a young man, I thought we would go from revolution from the...
So now you're stretching credulity.
Okay.
You're claiming that you were actually once young.
I thought the revolution would move in a straight line, and that I thought we had ended U.S. military intervention in the world when they, and we did for a time. Let's face it, the Sandinista revolution found that space in which they could develop because of the anti-Vietnam War movement. But with Lebanon and U.S. intervention in Lebanon, I realized how wrong I was. And as the movement disintegrated, I realized that revolution was not a straight line. And yet, what we have seen in the last 50 years is the globalized acceptance of the ideas of the movement. Let's just take the Me Too movement and the ways in which the situation of women has improved in terms of our spiritual understanding, not in terms of the institutions necessarily, sadly. The Kavanaugh fiasco yesterday is one indication of just how badly the institutions are behaving. But in terms of the ideas and the aspirations of the movement, also in terms of, I was shocked recently, I don't know if you read this same thing, but in 1968, after the Martin Luther King riots and all of this, the Kerner Commission issued a report that the United States was two societies, separate and unequal, one white, one black, and they documented statistically how this was. Recently, people went and looked at these same numbers, and the United States is worse off today than it was then. Even though we made improvements were made, we have failed again to maintain these. So I would say, not only feminism and the backsliding in improvements in race relations, but the idea of more democracy, participatory democracy, everywhere in the world, that's something people are talking about. The idea of opposing capitalism. I would say there are more people today on planet Earth who oppose capitalism than ever before in the history of our species. I would make that statement. So there are more people in the history of the world today who are against war, who don't believe there's any such thing as a just war. Even Howard Zinn, who we love and admire, was a bombardier during World War II. And he came to the conclusion later that there's no such thing as a just war. So I think that cannot be denied, that the movement's ideas and aspiration are larger today than ever before. Go ahead and deny it.
Well, so one of the arguments is that in part you've been making, is that the 60s happened, as you've articulated, with what normally propels change in society. The change in society is typically propelled by people reacting against and building for a better world against obvious injustice. So, you know, the anti-slavery movement was propelled again because of against the obvious injustice. The movement for people to what was then called gather together in combinations to better their working conditions, which later became called trade unions. So, again, what propels human progress is people banding together to make a better world. And that typically is against, as you also argued, up until the 60s was against obvious kind of in-your-face injustices. You're arguing that the 60s were in a part a break with that because it was almost more, you called it intuitive, so it was kind of cerebral. It was against, not just against what's the boot on your neck, if you like, but against more visionary, if you like. Whether or not that's the case, as you just articulated, those same injustices that are repeatedly kind of slapped in our face are greater than ever. So again, how do we bridge or even come to terms with that disconnect? There may or may not be greater awareness in the world today. There's undoubtedly, as you just said, we're actually more oppressed, more surveilled, there's greater wealth inequality than ever before. So, if you were being cliched and callous, you'd say, so what if people are more enlightened? They're more oppressed than ever before.
You're not going to like my answer. But let's say that you have broken up with your lover, your best friend, your partner, your wife, whomever, your partner, whatever, and you haven't been able to fall in love again. How can you say, well, when's that gonna happen? I suspect everyone in the room knows what I'm talking about. You go through a period where you feel very alone, where you feel, what's next for me? You don't know that. And we don't know how to make that happen, I think. I mean, I've read articles about staring into each other's eyes, or that you can't make it happen. But I think in general, it's a magical event that is based on intuition, that is based on something other than rational processes. And I suspect it's that same type of process that congeals social movements, where people's love for justice, for freedom, for each other, is greater than their individual needs for food and shelter, where somehow that process that occurs, that I think of as eros, as the life force, will again motivate humanity, because that consciousness now exists in people of the global unity. So I'm hopeful, even though, what did Adorno say after Auschwitz? It's for the sake of the hopeless that we are given hope. And it's a hopeless situation on the surface, but I think underneath things are ready to happen. More and more people are seeing through the institutions.
Do you have questions, comments from our esteemed?
Just to say that on your question, we often underestimate the blowback that happened after the 60s. I think when repression happens to such a degree that it's trauma-inducing, the transmission is difficult, and whether it's conscious or unconscious, those that come after see that event of their elders. And it influences their enthusiasm or their signing on. So from my perspective of going through the 60s and what came afterwards, how some of us who were extremely dedicated had to survive what came after. And very traumatic on so many levels. And many of us didn't have a lot of skills. We had inner work, we had, thank God, meditation, but we had to survive it. So the transmission was interrupted to carry it forth for someone who was raised by a parent who was traumatized. So I think that has to be calibrated in of why there isn't continuity, and to your point, why there are cycles. So there is this point of trauma, then there's an unconsciousness, then the seeds kind of go within, and it may just be that some of us survived, found personal ways to continue the revolution, but are waiting and surviving, and we're here today to help it bloom again.
Yeah, my name is Sauro. I think you made a presentation of the evolution of the movement after '68, very linear and coherent. But I guess you agree with me that there are a lot of contradictions. Just to give a couple of examples, I mean, you rightly highlighted the myth of the generation in late 16th, 17th US as well as in Europe about Ho Chi Minh or the Chairman Mao, but we cannot exactly say that they are an example of what we want to achieve, or what were the aspirations of the movement that we have in those here. I was rejoicing and marching in celebration in '75 when Saigon was taken. I've been traveling for work in Vietnam a few times. I would not call Vietnam a society that represented the aspiration of that particular movement in those years. Similarly, the movement that we have quoted about Asia, most of the cases they ended up with empowering different type of elite or opening the country to foreign capital. So sometimes out of this, sometimes we have good effect out of bad symbol, like were the symbol of Mao and Ho Chi Minh in the 60s, and sometimes we had bad effect out of good movement, out was the uprising in Philippines and Bangladesh and Nepal in between late 80s and early 90s. So I think it's important to keep a reflection on this coherence. And as a last element of contribution, I mean, coming from Europe, today in Europe there is a strong reaction against '68. I mean, '68 is seen to be, is perceived, especially by the middle class, working class, as the origin of all evil of globalization. A movement that by destroying the national institution, by destroying the regular family institution, has opened the field for global elite to take over in a strong financial capitalist movement. So it's important that if we want to go to the next phase, we should also understand what are the side effects of what our action has produced and what we want to achieve to go forward.
So against the backdrop of these revolutionary movements happening across the world in 1968, there is Oroville. And many of the people who actually went to Oroville came from these countries where this revolutionary fervor existed. Yet, Oroville did not reflect that, not at all. In fact, it reflected just, Oroville sounded to me from reading history and my experience in Oroville that it was a counterpoint to the revolutions that were sweeping the world. So I'm here at this conference to actually hope that I could learn something different about the origins of Oroville that would disprove that, because my contemporary experience of Oroville is that that there is nothing revolutionary as far as demands for workers, education, and equality, and the kind of justice that people fought for in these revolutions going on in Oroville today. That's just a comment. Doesn't require any response on your part, if you care to.
I just want to add that something from an experience that I had when I was a part of the Occupy movement in Oakland. And I noticed at the very beginning of the Occupy movement, which was based on, I believe, a strategy that you have presented from the 1968 ideals. Many people gathered together, of course. Moms came in with food and took care of the people that were tenting, all the students that were tenting. It was a wonderful movement. And then something happened, and I want to ask you a question on this. There was a dark element that entered into this Occupy movement, a gang, a group that was not there for the purpose of supporting the Occupy movement, but rather to destroy it. I've seen this happen in numerous times. I was in Africa, working in Somalia during the famine crisis in '86. I saw it happen there as well. There is an element that is coming in from a force that wants to destroy the altruism of the ideal of coming together to support whatever the movement is trying to support. I want to know if you are aware of this and what your point of view might be on how to respond to something like this. Because just on a side note of this, I've also seen homeopathic doctors who have treated people with cancer and other diseases have their professions destroyed and taken out. They're taken out of their ability to help people for what force is coming in. Again, this force that's coming in to destroy these people's reputations, their professions, etc. It's that same element. It sounds like an offshoot, but it isn't. It's tied together on some level of people that have alternative methods to serve the population. And yet there's this element, that's coming in, and it is real. It is not something that we were making up, who were there at the Occupy movement. We all saw it, we all knew it, but we couldn't do anything about it. They started violently intercepting the movement. I don't know if you were there, but it was pretty horrible, actually. I want to know your response to this, if you may, if I might.
I was not here on the West Coast. I was living in the Boston area at that time. And I went to Occupy in Philadelphia and Montreal and one of in New York, Zuccotti Park. So I had experiences that were quite different. I think here in Oakland, I've seen a film about it, and I've heard many personal accounts about it. And I believe what you're talking about has to do with the question of tactics, of, let's say, militant confrontation with the police. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that's a question that continues to animate great discussion. If you remember, the Black Panther Party had a very severe breakup that is related to that. But so did movements all over the world have problems with this. And I don't know the specifics in Oakland well, but when you were talking, I was reminded of something of Wilhelm Reich's. I don't know if you know the phrase emotional plague. And Reich said there are ways in which emotions that are very negative can overtake human beings and lead them to repress freedom and to repress love in situations. So I don't know if that's at all helpful, but of course in the case of homeopathic medicine, there's interest. People want to make money, and they don't want these alternative methods in which very often people don't make much money, right, to be used and become widespread. So.
Yeah.
So I know a fair amount about Occupy Oakland, though as a side note, my main claim to fame at Occupy Oakland was I was caught asleep while standing listening to speakers. It actually put me to sleep while I was still standing up. But beyond that, I think, I do think I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think that was equally as prevalent in the 60s, as the gentleman here was saying, or I think hinting at. And also what George had mentioned. I think the dark force that destroyed Oakland was largely the police and law enforcement. So I think that we have to talk about it in that context. The second context is partly of my question to George and to you all earlier, is about the problems and the politics of that the transmission of memory and of ideas. So one of the problems that Occupy Oakland has, which every new movement has, is that of reinventing the wheel. Now, as was the case when I was young and actively involved in social movements, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, so I was literally the next generation from you guys in that sense of my activism, my involvement. When you're young, you tend to view the world, certainly I did, I can only speak from my experience. But as a young person, you are operating largely in a vacuum, certainly an experiential vacuum. You tend to think that old people are, by definition, reactionary. I mean, youth culture perpetually is a rebellion against your parents and against authority. I mean, that's part of the definition of any youth culture. Let's move aside old people, we're the young generation, we've got something to say, etc., etc., etc. I was part of that in that I viewed the world very much in kind of black and white terms. And that even if I didn't have all the answers, that I kind of, I was going to figure it out. Which is a kind of direct contradiction to learning from the past. So how do you get beyond the constant reinventing the wheel? So I think that was going on in the 60s, it was going on in Occupy, 45 years later. I think secondly, we have to be honest about our differences. Sometimes they are debated. I mean, I think some of the same issues that you were talking about in Occupy, George was saying, were openly debated in these mass assemblies at Kwangju, over tactics. Tactics in what are, in their case was life or death situations, literally, or in Czechoslovakia in '68. Is our tactics going to be violent or non-violent? And that debate has been going on ever since people kind of resisted. But I think beyond that, there's much of the debates and much of the acrimony around the 60s is in the role of leadership. And when we're talking about movements which espouse equality and equality, and often espouse that we don't have leaders, we may just have spokespeople or whatever, is how do we actually acknowledge what leadership is, what role it plays, and who they really are. I know personally many of the people that were behind Occupy Oakland. They had their own particular agenda, which I personally did not agree with, and that agenda was one of direct confrontation. They used certain tropes, if you like, of Occupy, because that would seem to be successful. Occupy started in Zuccotti Park in New York. And so every Occupy that happened after that felt compelled, intuitively otherwise, to use those same tropes. Consensus, the General Assemblies. Again, whatever one thinks of these things, or the efficacy of these, that's what Occupy was. That and actually literally occupying space. And then the question of how you defend that space. But that doesn't address at all who's setting the agenda at these open meetings, who gets to speak at these open meetings, who's actually counting the consensus votes, whatever. And so actually what went on in Oakland was there was a group of about 20 or 30 people who had their own agenda. They actually didn't believe in open meetings, they didn't believe in consensus, but they were forced to use these methods for their own agenda, which was directly confrontational. Again, whether or not one agrees with that is kind of a different debate. You know, as you guys will know, they organised weekly fuck the police marches. That may or may not be a good tactic. Again, that's a different debate. But they had their own agenda and they enacted that. But I think it's a mistake to say that they are dark, sinister forces taking things over. I think it's being realistic about actually what is going on and, you know, who are the forces and the players involved in that particular form of organising. I think it's being about open and honest about what's going on.
I think we've reached the end of this period, but I did want to ask, actually sort of echoing the sentiment of Sauro and some other people, as a last question to you, George, which is it that the enemy is outside, or is there also the enemy within, in terms of the fact that what you call the eros effect is a sort of an anti-structural sort of wave, but does structure get imposed only from outside, or does structure also return from within with factors that are not worked out? And is the eros effect a temporary effect?
Thank you for that. And in a way, you've answered your own question, because it's definitely the case that the forces without, the forces that truly evil in the government, repression, you know, are there. But within the movement, there are incredible betrayals, violence that can sap the love forces that exist in the movement. But if I may say, that is the eros effect temporary? It is and it isn't, because as Occupy subsided, yet the conversation has been changed. Now, everyone talks about the 99%, the 1%. That's a change in our understanding of the universe. And it matches well with what Ramsey's saying about how there has never been such great global inequality. And I think when we look at the movements, so that, for instance, can good movements produce bad results and all of this? Yes, of course. The institutional system that we have of militarized nation states and representative, so-called representative democracy are corrupt and need to be transformed totally. Every movement, as has been said often, has only perfected these instruments of domination, not smashed them. And so the question is, can we prepare the groundwork for a completely new kind of society? Oroville, other experiments are very important. Ocean Beach, where I lived, was very important to me. All the institutions there are gone. There were tremendous betrayals inside the movement. The only remaining one is a food co-op that I helped start in 1971 that still exists, organic and everything, no meat, no chicken, no fish, blah, blah, blah. And it's a pleasure to go there. But all of them are gone. But the residue, I walk down the street in Ocean Beach and people say, I like your shoes, brother. Or to my partner, I said, oh, sister, you're looking good today. And it's not a sexual comment, it's just comments. And so the community survives. In the world today, the eros effect of '68 was gone. It reappeared, I argued, in all of these various forms. Without '68, we would not have had Occupy. We would not have had the wave of Asian democratization. We would not have had the overthrow of the Soviet regimes. So what's most important is the residue of freedom. Freedom is not some abstract concept. It's what people yearn for in their hearts in any particular historical situation. African Americans yearned for freedom from slavery. That was freedom. That's no longer what freedom means today. Freedom means something very different. and it's the changing definition of freedom is what these movements propel forward.
That I think we should break for lunch and come back at 12:30. I think there's a list of restaurants close by where one can go all around and please pick it up at the list there. And hope to see you all.
Thank you.